It's a great pleasure also to introduce our next speaker, Vint Cerf. And Vint is a vice president of Google and chief evangelist, and considered by many one of the fathers of the internet. Vint, would you like to come and speak?
Well, I thought that, first of all, those first discussions, I think, were very eye-opening in a way. The breadth of ethical questions that face us are really enormous, and I am only going to focus on a small aspect of it because I'm so concerned about this particular issue. Now, the title of the talk in the paper talked about the Internet of Things. I'm going to shift from just the Internet of Things to the notion of anything with software in it should be of concern to us, regardless of what it is, whether it's an Internet of Thing or a thing of the Internet or something else. So let me start with that. But I'd also like to back away and take a much broader perspective of this question of ethics and technology, and I'm going to draw on Isaac Asimov to start with. Those of you who are science fiction fans will remember his 3 laws of robotics, which eventually morphed into a 4th law, or 0th law. But if you imagine that we're talking not about robots, but about software that we are relying on every day, these are not too bad in the way of a framework for thinking about what we would want people who make that software to be considering. So the robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. I'd like that to be true of anything, any device that I'm relying on that has software in it. It says the robot must obey orders given to it by a human being, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. In other words, causing harm to a person, harm to yourself. And then the third one, the robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. So, for example, a self-driving car. I think that although this is drawing on from fiction, it's still not a bad kind of framework in which to think about the software that gets produced every day. There is this 0th law. I'm not quite sure how it applies unless there is a huge, how do I say this right? If we are concerned about the environment that we are creating as technologists, then speaking of humanity in general is, in fact, within scope of the ethical debate. And so here we might be asking, what is our technology doing to the society that we live in, or the societies that we live in? And have we failed that society? Have we failed humanity by inventing technology and propagating it that somehow proves to be harmful? And so perhaps all 4 of these observations still apply. These are sort of random thoughts. I mean, you all have heard the phrase, "First do no harm." It's actually not in the Hippocratic Oath, in case you thought it was. I certainly did until I Googled it this morning. This is, by the way, my solution to Alzheimer's is Google. And following that is my collection of email, because if I can't remember who sent it, but I remember something about what they said, I can often find it and then figure out who the hell was that. Well, but look at what the Hippocratic Oath actually says. "I will follow that system of regimen, which according to my ability and judgment I consider for the benefit of my patients, and abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous. I will give no deadly medicine to anyone, if asked, nor suggest any such counsel, and in like manner I will not give to a woman a pessary to produce abortion." That could be interpreted in brief as "do no harm." And so I think that the summary that we often apply to the Hippocratic Oath surely is good guidance for many decisions that we make in almost all aspects of ethics. Well, look, the internet is mostly software. So there are some implications of that. So a syllogism, bugs are bad. Most of the time, maybe they don't do too much harm. They just make the software not work the way you expected it to or intended it to. And incidentally, just going down a little alley for a minute, this is a wonderful opportunity to teach people about the frailties and wonders of software. I love it when kids start writing programs. I think everybody should have this experience. The first thing they discover is you can make it do whatever you can write a program to do. You can make it do what you want it to do. And then you discover what it does is what you told it to do. And that's not always the same as what you wanted it to do. And the difference between those two is called a bug. And I want these kids to learn how easy it is to make mistakes and create bugs, and how damn hard it is to find them. And the only reason I want them to have this experience, this programming experience, is so that, first of all, they are aware that they're going to be surrounded by this stuff and it's not always going to work the way it's supposed to. Second, I guess I want them to experience writing software because you're forced to think fairly critically and carefully and analytically in order to get a piece of software to do what you want it to do. The skill of thinking that way is actually very helpful, not just in writing programs, but in all aspects of life. And so this is a good thing for students to experience, which is why I believe all students who graduate from high school should have had some experience writing programs, finding bugs, and discovering how easy it is to write a piece of software that's hard to use, and how hard it is to write a piece of software that's easy to use. Which goes along with another observation: the internet is a weird thing. It remembers stuff you wish it didn't, and it forgets stuff you wish it would remember. So the outcome of this little syllogism is that we don't know how to avoid them for sure. We've been trying for the last 80 years of writing software, and we've failed miserably to find a method for avoiding making mistakes and creating bugs. Therefore, bugs will always be with us. So programmers and the companies that hire them should feel a deep responsibility, a sense of responsibility for the bugs that they create and the potential harm that those bugs might cause. I want the weight to be on the shoulders not only of the leadership in the company, but in the programmers whose software animates a lot of the equipment that we use. I also think, speaking to the university here, that better programming tools that help us detect mistakes would be very helpful and should be the focus of research. What I want is a little piece of software that's sort of figuratively sitting on my shoulder watching me while I'm programming. And as I'm writing my program, I want it to say, it just created a buffer overflow on line 123. What do you mean a buffer overflow? It says, look at what you did on line 123. And there, although, that's fun to have this little figurative thing on your shoulder, in fact, it's possible to write software that can analyze programming and detect certain kinds of really stupid mistakes. And if you've ever tracked down some of the bugs that, if you happen to have ever written a piece of software, a vast number of those bugs turn out to be head-slapping dumbass mistakes, like off by 1, or reference to a variable that nobody ever set. So you're using a random variable to make a decision. It's stupid stuff, which, by the way, is my little PS there: stupid never sleeps. This does, however, suggest something. If we want programmers and companies to feel a burden, then we better find some incentives to make that burden real. And up until now, to be quite honest about it, most programmers have gotten away with murder because they've been able to say, well, it's just a bug. But the consequences of those bugs are serious in many cases, and so we should care about that. And I think it's very important that we figure out how to teach not just students and programmers, but future business leaders to feel this. And we should be thinking about what incentives make sense. in order to assure that we get better quality outcomes. So there's another issue here. I mean, here we are. The internet is all over the place. Lots of good stuff happens on the internet. Lots of bad stuff happens on the internet. And the internet doesn't know it. And I think this is a terribly important thing for people to realize, that the internet is a piece of technology. All it does is allow computers to communicate with each other over arbitrary distances through arbitrary numbers of networks. The packets that flow through the network are like postcards, and they share with postcards a lot of common features. For example, a postcard has absolutely no idea how it was being carried. It doesn't know if it went on an airplane, back of a bicycle, or a boat. The internet packets don't have any idea how they're being carried. They don't know if they went over an optical fiber, a satellite channel, radio link, and they don't care. And that's one of the beauties of the architecture, so you can sweep in new communications technologies into the internet architecture and use them. The packets don't care, and they don't know. There's another feature of postcards. They don't know what's written on them. The internet packets don't know what they're carrying. They just have a little bag of bits, and they're trying to get from point A to point B with some probability greater than 0. That's all we're asking of them. And so since they don't know what they're carrying, they don't know what the applications are, which means when you want to invent a new application on the internet, you don't have to change the internet. You just have to change the interpretation of the bits in the packets that are arriving across the network. That has triggered a massive collection of new applications on the internet, especially as the capacity of the system has grown from the incredible 50,000 bit per second backbone of the ARPANET in 1969 to the 100 billion bit per second backbones of today to the trillion bit per second backbones of the next decade. So as these capacities go up, it becomes quite feasible to carry real-time video and audio, streaming everything, huge amounts of data flying back and forth through the net, billions of users concurrently interacting with data centers scattered all over the world. And so because the internet is basically stupid, it doesn't know what you're doing, it has tremendous flexibility. Now, the analogy I'd like to make here is that is roads, because the internet and its protocols are kind of like a road system. When Bob Kahn and I did this design, in some sense, we weren't thinking about it this way, but it's nice to look back. Think of it, we're creating a road system and the rules for how you build roads and how you use them. So, by the way, everybody should go on only one side of the road, not both, or otherwise you run into each other. So rules of the road and building the road system, but we didn't say, here's how you build the vehicles. We didn't say what buildings you should put by the side of the road. That was other people's choice. So now think about roads for a minute. People get on the roads in their vehicles and they run into each other, or they get drunk and they drive the cars and they run into each other. We don't blame the roads for that unless we've done a really crappy job of building the roads. I mean, if we've messed up the roads, we don't do the signals properly, we have bad signage, that's the road's fault or the road system's fault. But bad behavior by people is the responsibility of people. And so when we're trying to figure out what to do about the bad problems that we encounter on the internet, the abuses that show up in the internet, we have to remember that it's not the internet's fault that those abuses happen. It's because we're human. And that's why we still read Shakespeare 400 years after he wrote his plays, because he lays it all out. All the good and bad of human beings is right there in all the plays, and it's still with us today. So figuring out how to react and how to respond, how to build an ethical framework, and how to respond to unethical behaviors on the net should not be aimed at destroying the net or trying to regulate the net. It's not the net that needs regulation. It's the people who use it or abuse it that need to be regulated. So, yes, that's and rant. So now let's figure out what can we do about all this. Well, my first reaction as a technologist is to say, maybe there's a way to technically prevent the bad thing from happening. I mean, think about seatbelts. The thing that we did with seatbelts is try to prevent a bad thing from happening by making people wear them so they didn't get killed when they have an accident. Of course, we showed them pictures of what happens to people if you didn't have seatbelts. You'll notice that that wasn't quite enough to get people to wear seatbelts. So we also said, dear car makers, you have to make cars with seatbelts. If you don't, you can't sell them. That wasn't enough either. Then we said to the drivers, we said, okay, if we catch you driving without any seatbelts on, there will be consequences. But at least the technical thing was the seatbelt. And so that's an example of a technical response to trying to keep harm from happening. And we have technical responses to keep some harms from happening in the internet. I mean, we can try to detect malware. We can try to defend against denial of service attacks. We can try to help people overcome their proclivity for picking really crappy passwords like password because it's easy to remember. So you introduce two-factor authentication, for example, as a way of strengthening your ability to authenticate and making it harder for somebody else to pretend to be you. So I think one important reaction from the ethical point of view for at least the people who are trying to cope with internet problems is to recognize there may be technical means of trying to inhibit or reduce the incidence of some of these bad problems. But you can't stop all the bad behavior using technical means. So what's the next opportunity that we have? Well, I would call this post hoc enforcement. If we catch you doing this, there will be consequences. And of course, we won't catch everybody. But it's important to say, as a society, the following things are unacceptable, the following things are considered antisocial, and the society will, if it catches you, punish you for that. So we can now say for some of the behaviors on the internet that are unacceptable to our society, that there will be consequences. Now, the thing that makes this harder to do than it might look in this simple syllogism is that the internet is global in scope. The packets of the internet don't actually know if they've crossed an international boundary. In fact, it was designed that way on purpose. We could have designed the internet to be kind of like the phone system with country codes. But remember, this was being built for the Defense Department. We were going to use it and are using it for command and control. Can you imagine if you're planning to invade country B in 2 weeks and you have to go to country B and say, hi, we need some address space from country B so we can run our command and control system because we're planning to invade you in a couple of weeks. That doesn't work very well. So we designed it to have no country boundary recognition at all. Now, in the higher layers of protocol in the domain name system, the www.foo.fr, that's France, and .de is Germany. So in the labeling side of the system, there is some recognition of country boundaries. However, there's also global top-level domains like .com and .net and .org and so on. So the internet really, in large measure, does not pay attention to the boundaries between countries, which makes it a much harder environment to figure out how to manage. Because if some perpetrator in one country harms someone in another country, now you have an international problem to deal with. And you have to have cooperation between the countries in order to try to cope with tracking down the perpetrator. And that means agreements. And right now, the kinds of agreements that we have are very weak. One of them, the MLAT, is called the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, has an extremely clumsy and slow working process which doesn't cope with the internet speeds that we're all familiar with. What that suggests to me is that from an ethical point of view, we have work to do. We have serious agreements to build between countries who care about protecting people from potential harms and abuse that they experience in the internet environment. So there's a lot of work to make this second proposition function well in a global scale. And then there's finally one last thing in this syllogism, and that's moral suasion. You just tell people, don't do it, it's wrong. Now, I know that sounds a little weak, but I want you to think for just a second about gravity. Gravity is the weakest force in the universe. But when you have a big mass, it's really powerful. So in the sociological sense, if a large fraction of the population believes this is wrong, then you can use moral suasion to very good effect because there will be real pressure on people to behave better. So my proposition for, I can't stay unfortunately this afternoon, but my proposition for this meeting anyway, is to try to extract from our conversations some of those key framework ideas that will help us apply ethics not only to the problems we're experiencing in the internet, but the other problems that we heard about this morning and the ones which I am sure are going to be brought up the rest of the day. But if you can extract some insights into how to apply ethical thinking and how to equip people to think ethically, then you may very well have made an important contribution to the society that we all hope we can live in. Thank you very much.